Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Community Development, Housing and General Government Committee meeting today, November 9th, 2021. Due to the pandemic, all committee members are participating virtually. For virtual meetings, committee members will be muted until asked to be heard. When there is a vote, it will be necessary to take a roll call vote. A committee member will be recognized, raise their hand, and state their vote. Committee members are Councilmember Anna Scipio, Vice Chair, Councilmember Robert Clark, and Councilmember Kevin Monday, and yours truly, Mayor Pro Tem Denise Adams. City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Monday.
Present.
Councilmember Clark.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Here. Today on our agenda, we have 6 consent items and we have 7 general agenda items. I am going to ask Community Development, Ms. Richmond, who has her name assigned to practically all of the consent. First of all, are there any items on there based on housing that we need to address that might change the outcome of us voting on these items? Ms. Richmond. Or Ms. Newman.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the council. There are no consent items that I need to address at this time.
Thank you so much. Members of the committee and council, are there any consent items that you would like to be pulled for discussion? If there are none, I will entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded by Councilmember Monday, seconded by Councilmember Scipio. City Clerk, may we please have the roll call vote?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Monday.
Aye.
Councilmember Clark.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes. Will you please call the first general agenda item, please?
Item G1, resolution amending Article 1, Conditions of Employment, Section 20, Political Activity of the City of Winston-Salem Personnel Resolution.
Thank you. Attorney Carmen.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, committee members, and council members. Item G1 seeks to amend the personnel resolution. I think the best document for me to focus on would be the chart of political activity. If I can get Ms. Keeney or Ms. Tui to pull it up, put it on the screen for me, that would be great.
And while she's doing that, City Clerk, how many council members are present in the meeting? I'm like Councilmember Clark, you can't see the 9 people.
I think everybody's present.
Thank you. Everyone's present except Councilmember Taylor. Thank you.
It's the political activity chart, which should be the 3rd item in the agenda package. Okay. Great, thank you. I guess over the weekend or earlier in the week, I received a couple of phone calls about that's the housing, sorry. We need the item for G1. If the council members don't mind, or committee members rather, don't mind, you can pull the item from your agenda. It should be the 3rd item in for G1, political activity chart.
Yes.
Okay.
Just a moment. Can we make sure that the committee at least can see this on their iPads or whatever?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
You got it?
Councilmember Scipio.
Okay.
I can see it.
And Councilmember Monday. Okay. We good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, looking at the chart, as I mentioned over the weekend and earlier Oh, there it is. Thank you. Earlier in the week, I received a couple of phone calls with respect to a provision in the city personnel resolution regarding political activity. In particular, the clause in section 20 that was of concern is the clause or statement that prohibits a city employee from being a candidate for political or partisan elected office unless on an unpaid leave of absence. There was concern about that language potentially prohibiting an employee, in particular a young employee, who may not have the financial wherewithal to be on a leave of absence from being a candidate for office. In checking the records, it looks like that provision has been a part of our personnel resolution at least since 1993. I sort of believe it's been there longer than that, but I was not able to go back any further than that given the short time frame I needed to try to put together the draft personnel resolution amendment. But anyway, like I said, the existing language requires that an employee who wishes to be a candidate for partisan or political elected office has to be on unpaid leave of absence. What you have before you is a proposed amendment to that particular provision in the personnel resolution in section 20 that simply removes that language, that prohibition, a requirement will no longer be a part of the personnel resolution. What I have inserted in the personnel resolution in place of that language is a statement that makes it clear due to office incompatibility that should a city employee decide to run for mayor or city council, and should that person become successful, then that person will basically resign or forfeit his or her position as a city employee, because you can't be a city employee and elected official, because if you serve in both capacities, you're basically supervising your boss, the city manager. So that's consistent with case law, and so I went ahead and put that language in there. I will also note that the personnel resolution still contains a prohibition on the use of city funds, supplies, and equipment for partisan or political purposes, except where such political uses are otherwise permitted by state law, which I'm not aware of any at this point, but I left it in there because it's consistent with state law. In that short period of time that I had to look at this, I did reach out to a couple of my colleagues in Charlotte, Durham, Greensboro, and High Point. The city of Charlotte does not have similar language in its personnel policies as the city of Winston-Salem. They just rely upon the state law, which basically prohibits cities from restricting employee political activities while off duty. It also, as I stated before, prohibits the use of city funds, equipment, and so forth for political purposes. The city of Durham has a provision somewhat similar to what is being proposed. It prohibits an employee from being a candidate for elective office to a governmental position in a partisan election inside of Durham County. If you'll scroll up, please. It also prohibits an employee from being a candidate for nomination, election, or appointment in Durham city municipal elections. And that is slightly different from what's being proposed, because this basically starts at the point of nomination, and you can't be an employee if you're basically a candidate for nomination, election, appointment to city council. The proposed amendment that I prepared for your consideration simply requires that person, if they are successful, to basically cease their employment with the city. Also, in Durham, let's see, candidacy in any of these situations results in immediate forfeiture of city employment. And it does have a provision where if the employee, for whatever reason, is unaware of his or her candidacy or of the employment forfeiture provision, that employee will be given the opportunity to withdraw his candidacy prior to the election. The city of Greensboro has a provision in its personnel policies that prohibits an employee from being a candidate for nomination, election, or appointment to a political office for the position in the city of Greensboro or Guilford County. Again, it starts at that earlier stage than what is being proposed. And in Greensboro, it appears that if you are a candidate for nomination, election, or appointment to a political office in the city of Greensboro, Guilford County, you would basically forfeit your position as an employee. And then lastly, the city of High Point, it says any city employee who shall become a candidate for a nomination or election to any city elective office shall immediately resign from employment. So it's somewhat similar to some of the other cities. But I, again, have prepared this amendment for your consideration and look for any direction you all may have, because I, as I said before, put it together rather quickly based upon the comments I received over the weekend and earlier, I guess, yesterday.
Thank you, Attorney Carmen. Councilmember Clark?
Yeah, Ms. Carmen, what caused you to look at this? Because I didn't know it was an issue.
Apparently, there is a city employee that is interested in seeking elective office. It's
Okay.
perhaps all that I can say at this point.
That's fine. By the way, the law looks good to me.
Councilmember Scipio, and then Councilmember McIntosh. You're on mute, Councilmember Scipio.
Thank you very much. My question is, the policy doesn't state how the employee would serve in his city job during campaigning, or if they get the position, serving in that position when the time of that service is conflicted with the timing of their employee. So how does that set up for that person being supervised or giving time off? Is it, do they have to take personal time? How does that happen? And should that be in the policy?
As the proposal would not require the city employee to take time off while running. The current provision requires that they be on a leave of absence, unpaid leave of absence, basically to be a candidate for partisan or political office. But the provision that is being proposed would not require such. However, the other language in the existing policy would preclude a city employee from, like I said, using city funds, supplies, or equipment for partisan purposes. They cannot use their employment in any way connected with that campaign for office. So if an employee basically determines that he or she cannot fulfill his or her duties as an employee while running for office, then it's being incumbent upon that employee to basically seek some time off. It will not be a requirement, but it'll be incumbent upon that employee to do that.
So if an employee then has an arrangement with their supervisor, say if they want to go to a political campaign event, then they work it out with their immediate supervisor.
Yes.
Their time away from their job. Is that the way that would work? And that's the way it currently would work?
Well, currently they would have to be on an unpaid leave of absence. But with this provision, should it pass, yes, they would have to work it out with a supervisor, with the understanding, though, their employment with the city comes first. So if the supervisor is not able to give them time off to do that because there's something going on with respect to their employment, then they're going to have to accept the fact that their employment comes first and decide, you know, what's more important.
Councilmember McIntosh.
To Councilmember Scipio's question, I think it's similar to the situation with anybody who is working. If you're going to, no matter who you're working for, you got to get clearance from your boss unless you own the company to take time off. And so therefore it's up to our staff to manage people who are running. I like this because it's hard enough in 2021 to get people to run for office. And we need to encourage people, especially young people, to step up and get involved. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, for somebody who is still working and needs a paycheck to take a leave of absence or to quit a job in order to run for office. So I'm very much in support of this.
Any other comments from any other committee and council members? Councilmember Monday.
Basically, to echo what Jeff said, I think this will encourage some of our employees to get involved in offices and areas where they haven't had an opportunity in the past. So I think it's a good way all the way around to engage our employees more in other parts of city government, or not city government, but municipal government.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I'll make a motion to approve. Or do we need a motion?
Yes, you need a motion.
Second, Monday.
It has been moved by Councilmember Clark and seconded by Councilmember Monday. And I'd like to make a comment. I agree with everything that everyone said, but when people decide to run for office, I know when I decided to run in 2009, I had to meet with the HR manager, I had to meet with my manager, and the managers had to meet with their managers. And they all sat in a room and asked me a series of questions, basically, Attorney Carmen, similar to the policy, to help me understand the policy of the company I worked for, that I was required to be at work, that if I wanted to do anything pertaining to running for office or in office, I had to use my vacation time and personal time. And I had to sign up for it based on the policy. I couldn't come in at 8 o'clock in the morning and say I need 4 hours of personal time or comp time. And I think when people make the decision to run for office, as you've all said, and you need to work, this is a job, but it doesn't pay like a job, that you need your job. And I'm sure when people make the conscious decision, they understand the responsibilities of the first priority, which is their quality of life, their real job. And the second job is the political job. But as most of you know, the ones of us, Councilmember Clark and others that were working when we came on council, you have to do some balancing. You can't be at everything. You still got to fulfill, as my bosses used to tell me, we don't want 100%, we now want 300% from you if you've decided to do this. So my advice to those in the listening audience and employees, if you decide to undertake the desire to run, just make sure your priorities are set as to how you're going to manage both of them and be effective at doing both of them. I am glad we're doing this. Again, as you said, it's hard enough to get people to run nowadays. But if we keep saying we want younger people to get involved in the process versus just asking them to be a part of it, this is one of the tools we can do to help facilitate that. So with that, we've heard the motion. It's Councilmember Clark, and I got a comment from Councilmember Larson. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Difference here is, I understand that if they are elected to office, that they cannot hold a city's job position any longer. Is that the way that reads?
That is correct. They automatically resign or forfeit the city position.
So they would lose the city salary and they would go on the salary of the elected position, which is not, I think, even equal to the lowest salary paid by a city employee. And this, so as a matter of record, the difference being that if you weren't working for the city and you're running for city office, as Councilmember Adams noted, that there's a possibility you could continue on in your civilian job and still then hold office, or like Councilmember Clark does, run a business and still hold office. But then now that option does not. So economically, it's going to be a challenge, I think, for our city employees to undertake this. But good luck with it, as they say. Thank you.
It's been moved and properly seconded by Councilmember Clark. Councilmember Mundy, City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy.
Aye.
Councilmember Clark.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes. And the motion passes. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so generous and forward in letting young people and other people know that we want everybody to have an opportunity to do something, to serve. Next item, please.
Item G2, information on the 2020 Decennial Census population counts. This item was continued from the October 12th, 2021 Community Development Housing General Government Committee.
We've been waiting on this one. Again, you'll be getting an update every general government meeting going forward until we actually get the resolution to vote on the map when they're done. Ms. Francis.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams and members of council.
Good afternoon.
Let's see. I'm going to share my screen if that's all right. Are you able to see this?
We lost you. We had you a minute and then we lost you.
We can see you.
Hold on. Let's see.
Kaylin, I got you.
All right. Thank you.
There we go.
All right. So I am going to present the initial data report for the census, the Decennial Census. And we're going to start with some national trends. So as you can see from this map, the total U.S. population is now 331,449,281. The total population increase was 22,703,743. The states with the largest populations are now California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania. And the states with the smallest populations are Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Next slide. As you can see from this graph, the United States population grew 7.4% in the last decade, which is the second lowest growth rate of any decade since the census began in 1790. And at 7.4%, it's only slightly higher than the lowest overall growth rate, which was 7.3% during the decade of the Great Depression. But unlike that anomaly, this is likely an ongoing trend due to the aging of the white population, decreased fertility rates, and slowing immigration. Next slide. As you can see from this table, the fastest growing states were Utah, Idaho, Texas, North Dakota, and Nevada. And the slowest growing states were Connecticut, Michigan, Ohio, Wyoming, and Pennsylvania, with Illinois, Mississippi, and West Virginia actually losing population. Next slide. So this map shows all of the counties within the United States, 53% of which lost population between 2010 and 2020, which speaks to a trend that we've been seeing of urban areas gaining population and rural areas continuing to lose population. The 5 counties with the highest growth were Harris County in Texas, which includes Houston, Maricopa County in Arizona, which includes Phoenix, King County in Washington State, which includes Seattle, Clark County in Nevada, which includes Las Vegas, and Tarrant County in Texas, which includes Dallas and Fort Worth. Los Angeles County is still the largest in the country with over 10 million residents. Next slide. So as you can see from this map, moving on to North Carolina, North Carolina's growth rate was 9.5% this decade, which is the lowest of any decade since 1910. Our overall population is 10,439,388. North Carolina's growth rate is the 15th highest of any state, and North Carolina is the 9th most populous state. And we have actually gained 1 congressional district as a result of our population increase. The highest growth rates occurred in the Triangle, Charlotte, and Wilmington, as you can see from the next slide. So this shows all of the counties within North Carolina and their population growth rates. And as you can see, Charlotte, Wilmington, and the Triangle continue to grow. Next slide. So moving on to Forsyth County. Forsyth County's growth rate last decade was 9.1%. Our overall population is now 382,590, and it is the 4th largest county in the state behind Wake, Mecklenburg, and Guilford. You can see from this map, that this shows population change rates by tract for the county, with those tracts in dark blue being the ones that experience the highest percentage of growth, and the ones in dark red being tracts that have had negative growth within the last decade. Next slide. This can also be represented on this heat map, where you can see the areas in yellow and red represent that higher percentage of growth, and those in blue and not covered represent little or negative change. So you can see that downtown has increased in population significantly. Next slide. So looking at this chart, Winston-Salem's growth rate was 8.7%, which is the third lowest of any city above 100,000 in North Carolina. But at 249,545, we still have the fifth highest population of any place in North Carolina, with the largest being Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro, and Durham. Next slide. As you can see from this chart, each ward has gained in population. The South Ward and the Northwest Ward were the quickest growing wards at 15.6% and 13.2%, respectively. And the East Ward and Northeast Ward were the slowest growing at 5.1% and 4.7%. Next slide. So that brings us into redistricting. So in 2010, Winston-Salem's wards were brought within less than 1% of exact equality. Next slide. So it's required after the decennial census that if any ward is larger or smaller than 5% of exact equality, redistricting must occur. Next slide. And so according to the census's recently released population counts, redistricting will be necessary. Mr. King will talk a little bit more about this process in a few minutes, but for now we'll move on to racial and ethnic trends. So in looking at the diversity index, which is a metric that tells us the chance that two people chosen completely at random will be from different racial and ethnic groups, you can see that the overall U.S. diversity index score is 61.1%. North Carolina's is lower at 57.9, but Forsyth County's is higher than both the state and national rates at 62.2. Next slide. And here you can see those numbers broken down. By the nation's diversity index score and racial and ethnic components, as well as North Carolina and Forsyth County. So you can tell that we are more diverse than both the nation and the state. Next slide. So this next slide shows information on the race and ethnicity of the city's total population, as well as the population by race and ethnicity of each ward in both 2010 and 2020. One note, because ethnicity is a separate metric, residents that identified as Hispanic are also counted in the totals of white, Black, and other. But these counts and percentages are included here to give you a picture of both the racial and ethnic compositions of your wards. So Winston-Salem's white population decreased in the last decade by 3,214, but still accounts for 45.84% of the total population. The Black population accounts for 33.81%, and other races and those identifying as being multiracial have grown significantly in the past decade, now comprising 20.35% of the total population. The Hispanic population has also grown and is now 17.17% of the total population. Next slide. So in mapping Forsyth County's population density by race and census block, on this map you can see that one dot equals one person, with the red dots being white residents, dark blue dots being Black residents, and light blue dots being other. So this map shows where both the population is more dense and the racial composition of that area. Next slide. This is the same information, but for Hispanic and non-Hispanic residents. So the green dots represent Hispanic residents and the red dots represent non-Hispanic residents. So you can see again the density of the population in certain areas and where our residents have identified as Hispanic. Next slide. So one last note on age, 77.9% of the US population is aged 18 and over. 78.1% of North Carolina's population is aged 18 and over. So we are slightly older than the average, but that must largely be related to the retirement communities in the mountains and the coast. And Forsyth County is younger at 77.7%. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. King to talk a little bit about the next steps in the redistricting process, and then we will be available to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. So just to kind of hit a little bit on the redistricting process, our staff has now got the data in the GIS system that we'll be using for the upcoming redistricting process, and really just kind of the metrics that we'll use for that process. Number one, we'll keep the existing council members within their existing wards. We want to preserve the core of the existing ward, so we are not going to start with a blank slate and start drawing new lines from scratch. We want to start with the core of those wards and work around the edges to get the population where we need it to be in order to balance. Third, we want to have 8 wards within 2% or less population difference of each other. 5% is the legal standard. Traditionally in Winston-Salem, we have gone much tighter than that. And so our goal is to get within 2% or less population difference in order to further the one voice, one vote standard and ideal. We do want to maintain the balance of majority minority wards in the city. We currently have 4, and our expectation and goal will be to end this process with the same number. Number 5, we don't want to split census blocks by ward boundaries. That's important for data tabulation moving forward. And number 6, we want ward boundaries to follow logical boundaries, such as major roadways, railroad tracks, geographical features, things of that. Our goal is to have a draft map for review and comment, perhaps in the winter 2021, spilling over 2022. Those are some big bucket terms there. We know there's a lot of public interest around this, and we certainly want to build in opportunities for public comment, input, and review. I think that the time to do that is to look at that map, to have something to react to, and that's something where we would work with council to build a process that council is supportive of that could hit multiple different avenues, whether it be virtual meetings, in-person town hall meetings, and certainly using social media to get the word out for opportunities for engagement on that. And the goal is to really have a redistricting map ready for public hearing and adoption somewhere around the spring/summer of 2022, depending on how this process unfolds as we get into the data examination of this. That concludes the process, and I'll end the screen sharing there. And if there's any questions, Kaylin or I would be glad to handle those. Mayor Pro Tem, I'll just note for you, I looked it up, April 29th, 2019. That was the date of our first kickoff meeting of the Complete Count Committee at the Enterprise Center. So this date has been a long time coming that we've been at this. So.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Francis, and thank you, Mr. King, and to all of the employees that work diligently to get the count with the county and the city, and the collaboration between the elected officials to try to get it done. Unfortunately, like most cities in the country, we were operating under some different circumstances that none of us have ever seen because none of us were living during the Depression. So the count as we know it is significantly, to me, lower than what I had expected. But now we're at a point we got to wait 10 more years and try again. Are there any comments or questions? Councilmember Clark, you're on mute.
Speaking of redrawing, the state just redrew their districts for the House and the Senate. I would like a map, and it'd probably be easier to do it for the county, but a map where I can see who's going to be representing the West Ward in Raleigh. And I don't know if you can do it on one map or two, but I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
The paper had it, and it was so darn small. I couldn't read it.
You couldn't see it.
Oh. Yep. And it was all the same color. They had light yellow and beige were the two colors they used.
Yeah, that happens when we get older. Councilmember McIntosh.
Yeah, I'm going to refrain from a reading glass comment. So this report got me all down into the weeds with my spreadsheets. So I just got a couple of questions for Kaylin. When I tally up the populations from the report for the total city, I come up with 251,565 versus the number that we have talked about as being our population number of 249 and change. I mean, obviously it's not a huge difference, but at some point, if you can let me know what that differential is. And then I just wanted to throw something out. So if we took, this city grew by 21,948 people over that period of time, that 10 years. So that's 2,194 people per year. I look at that from a standpoint of how many housing units we need to build to stay up to that. And if we take the Census Bureau's number of 2.62 people per household, that's 837 units per year. Now, this year we will exceed that. But over the course of the past 10 years, we have been way, 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 way behind that. And that's why a large part of why we find ourselves in the position that we are, because in 2010, 11, 12, we built nothing. So we are playing serious catch up. And these numbers really do, to me, show kind of why we're in the position that we are. So just those few comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the committee or the council? Okay, this is for information. Again, you'll be seeing these types of updates monthly until we get it done. Thank you, Mr. King, and thank you, Ms. Francis. City Clerk, would you please call the next item?
Item G3, update on draft strategic plan for the fiscal years 2022 through 2025.
Mr. Tesh.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee and council. I will tell you, I think they have just started pressure washing outside of my office, so I hope there is no noise coming from that. Let me share my screen here. So we have a presentation. I have a new laptop, and I'm going to try and do this in full screen mode for you. And so does everyone see the second slide? Did it just switch?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so this is the draft strategic plan at this point. A few slides here. This whole presentation is about 27 or 30 slides long, and I'm going to move through some of it kind of quickly, respective of the fact that we do have a lot of things on the general agenda. But we're going to talk about background and the amount of community engagement that was done as part of the process earlier this year, the strategic priorities that the mayor and city council reviewed and ranked earlier this year at its workshop, the 83 draft action items that staff have created to support those priorities. And then we'll talk about next steps, including we have here Arpa as a funding vehicle, but that should really be expanded to be federal legislation in general, because we have both the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, as well as the Infrastructure Investment Act and Build Back Better potentially coming. So lots and lots of federal and state help, hopefully supporting a lot of the priorities. So just quickly, these are screenshots from the community engagement and stakeholder meetings that we had earlier this year. There were 5 of them for specific stakeholders and for the community at large. So just a reminder to the community that there was a lot of feedback through this process. What came from those in terms of the way they were facilitated were conversations about what is a current need and how can the city support that. And what you see in these bullet points are considerations from the community about equity, economic development and jobs and workforce development, reinvesting in older or dilapidated areas, supporting the arts and entertainment industries, issues around transportation and digital equity, as well as general infrastructure maintenance and how residents communicate with the city and get feedback and information. Those city support actions very similar to those looking at economic disparities, affordable housing, workforce development, transportation, community policing. And then that little graphic off to the right, the mayor and city council did a very similar exercise on one of the days at the workshop. And you see things there related to equity and housing and economic mobility and poverty alleviation as some of the highest ideas that would become priorities from that workshop. Also, a quick note, not intended for people to see these. These are just graphics, but these are the types of visual information that were reviewed in terms of data from resident survey and feedback. So there was a significant amount of information that staff and the mayor and city council reviewed with respect to that process. So getting into what happened at that strategic planning workshop, that 2-day workshop, City Council identified 15 priority areas. You'll see 15 on this page, and then you'll see 16 afterwards. The facilitator pushed 2 of the ideas together, and staff has broken them back apart. They were neighborhood aesthetics and infrastructure maintenance, and she had interpreted them together. We went back and reviewed all the minutes and the video, and there were a lot of issues around transportation and infrastructure maintenance that really kind of necessitated it being a separate priority. So what you see here were the rankings in terms of the tiers that these priorities were put into at that workshop earlier this year. And we had a directive from staff, or excuse me, from the mayor and city council to staff to turn these into action statements. So we took these 15, again, to become 16, and turned them into action statements where we would talk about our focus, our strategy, where we wanted to increase programs and partnerships, potentially look at providing funding, and how we would do that. I won't read through each one of these. It's available publicly. So anyone in the public, residents can go out and review these. And again, there are slides through this presentation that hit on every single one of them. And we will try and get through those relatively quickly here this afternoon. We'll note here in terms of focus areas and tiers, 11 of the 16 priorities fall into economic vitality and diversity or livable neighborhoods. So a very strong focus on economic mobility, poverty alleviation, affordable housing, neighborhood aesthetics, and community engagement. And all of the priorities in tier 1 and 2 were in EVD or livable neighborhoods. So from that workshop, the collection of those priorities very much focused on the economy, the ability of people to move up in the economy and to provide affordable housing and good community livability. The next slides are going to go through each one of these. I'm not going to read every single one, but these again are those 83 total draft action items for the 16 priorities. The first one being a focus on job creation and workforce development. So we have items here related to setting up what we would look at as community partner meetings to talk about what are our greatest needs here, apprenticeship programs, assisting small businesses. You'll see sprinkled throughout all of these reports or actions related to Arpa, and we will extend that to other federal legislation in terms of the ability to use some of those funds to support a lot of these activities and partnerships with PTRC and potentially even with the school board to look at opportunities for workforce development. So I'm going to, if you have questions, please feel free to cut me off, but I'm also going to try and get through these pretty quickly. The second priority related specifically to pre-K programming. We do have the Forsyth County Early Childhood Education Task Force that is looking at this, as well as funding that the city has already appropriated to assist in this area. So I think continuing to work through those partnerships, understanding the greatest needs for the city and through the county, and then working through those partnerships to see how we can support and potentially fund programs in this area. Affordable housing policies and creating a long-term funding mechanism for affordable housing. So you see in here, and you know that we're proposing $20 million in ARPA funding for affordable housing, but this would be also a review of our affordable housing policies, how they connect with our economic development policies, potentially looking at land banking opportunities and setting up some kind of trust for that. And looking at what some of our other jurisdictions are also doing as well. Priority number 4 around creating a funding mechanism for economic development sites and infrastructure, as well as assisting small businesses. Some of these similar to things that we've seen in prior years in terms of reviewing policies and looking to incentivize business recruitment, but also looking to have some of those stakeholder engagement meetings at a very high level about what are our highest needs for job creation, potentially as they link back to some of the workforce development strategies that we'll be looking at too. We'll note down there, reviewing eligibility for ARPA. Generally, economic development is not ARPA eligible, but as we see people push the limits or as additional guidance comes, we will see if there's an ability to do both economic development and community development together through ARPA funding. Number 5, generally this was poverty cessation. We rewrote it to be implement programs designed to reduce poverty and eliminate barriers to economic mobility. So you do see a lot in here about using ARPA funds in the specific areas that are allowed in QCTs for social assistance and economic assistance programs. Reviewing what was in the Poverty Thought Force and came through the Partnership for Prosperity's issue forums to look at appropriate places for City Council to take action and review policies. And some other things related to potential impact of decreasing fares in the transit system and other opportunities. Number 6, this was kind of the reopening. And so there are things here related to working with the travel and tourism industry to see what their highest needs are in reopening the economy, as well as looking at what some of our other peer jurisdictions are doing as well, trying to benchmark ourselves and see what we need to do to continue through this pandemic to get to a fully reopened state. Number 7, strategies around neighborhood engagement. So you see here things that are really looking at relationship building with the communities, looking at the data that we have access to and performing analytics on that, looking at opportunities to engage in new ways that we haven't done before. So a very heavy focus on getting information out and getting information back to us from the community. Number 8, funding local arts as well as supporting public arts initiatives. So you see things here from the Public Art Master Plan, as well as 2 different mechanisms under which we would provide additional funding to the arts community, both through the annual budget and through a capital set-aside policy. Number 9, this one was engaging in fundraising efforts and supporting additional capacity building in nonprofits. So looking at the opportunities to do that, specifically in qualified census tracts and using that equity lens to determine where the greatest needs are and how the mayor and city council could help fund those areas. Number 10, supporting the green economy, looking at our sustainability efforts. So some very specific things here related to alternative fuel vehicles, solar PV, specific infrastructure related to the green economy, some of our sourcing practices and construction projects and the like. Number 11, addressing the digital divide. So what you see in these is really a reliance on the Forsyth County Digital Equity Commission and their report to provide some initial engine here to have discussions about infrastructure, equipment, and digital learning that's needed throughout the community, how we would focus that, and then also how state law authority works within the context of what their recommendations are. This is an area where we do have some pretty stringent state law considerations about what we can do with building out broadband infrastructure, but making it available to the public. Number 12, this one specific to child care needs. Again, looking additionally, just even outside of the pre-K initiatives, how child care and the need to have it affects the workforce and the things the city could do with its partners in terms of making that easier. Number 13, again, this was the one priority that city staff pulled apart into 2. So one here on improving the physical landscape of communities, looking at individual property owners, maintenance and sanitation standards and how to hold them accountable for that. Looking at some of our aging facilities for revitalization here in neighborhoods specifically, looking at increasing funding for programs that would help increase the overall aesthetic of communities and things of that nature. Number 14, more specific to transportation infrastructure. So looking at streets, bridges, and sidewalks, the needs there, as well as there were conversations about the future of light and commuter rail and multimodal transportation. So really planning for the future as well as maintaining current infrastructure. Number 15 really focuses kind of on internal efficiency, eliminating duplications, looking at some of our processes, particularly with nonprofit agencies where they may be duplicating things, and potentially providing additional resources for process improvement, auditing functions, and things like that. And then finally, 21st century law enforcement and law enforcement reforms. So a lot of action items here around how to look at calls for service, different models for responding to those types of calls for service, how we publish and make data available externally related to our public safety departments, new trainings, and best practices available, incarceration diversion programs. So a lot of draft action items here. That is the list here, the summary. Again, 83 in total. Looking for feedback on any gaps that where staff has significantly missed something or modifications to some of those to ensure that we are pointed in the right direction. We'll be bringing this to the mayor and city council for formal adoption in January, as you have noted, taking off the normal regular business meeting in December. We'll hit again that lots of federal funding coming down the pipe with equity focuses and specific focuses on infrastructure and other things that directly align with strategic priorities, and a promise to bring better reporting on where we are on a semi-annual basis so that we can tell the public and tell you, how we're making progress in these areas. So that is my presentation. I'd be more than happy to take any questions. I know I moved through it very quickly, and I'm sorry.
Cash, you are my new hero. You went through that like I would do it. I love it. You were on it. Love it. But we all know that it's up to us to read. Okay? And the amount of data and information that you put out there, you and your staff, phenomenal. The tweaks, if we make any, or commentary, it'll be minimal, I'm sure, and you'll hear from the council members. At this time, I will ask, are there any comments or questions from the committee and the council? Councilmember Scipio. You're on mute.
I can hear her. That's because she's right next door.
She's on mute. We can't unmute you. You have to do that.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you, whoever was in charge. My concern to my fellow council members, I'm very concerned that 37, almost 38% of our city is qualified census tracts. To me, that's a tremendous amount of our city to be, to me, distressed. And yet we are attempting in our strategic plan to address some of those areas. But I would hope that we will be a little more intentional in our strategic plan in trying to identify ways that we know will shift the conditions in some of those census tracts. We can talk generalities, but we need to be very intentional about making sure that 10 years from now, we have less of our city in poverty. I'm not so certain that our strategic plan is really moving to make dramatic changes in that. It's a bit here, a bit there. So as we look at the strategic plan, I would like for us to see exactly what we're going to do to shift the conditions of people living in those census tracts, in something that we know is definitely measurable and it produces change. A few things will do change, but it won't shift the census tracts in terms of economics. And I would hope that we would think a little more thoughtful about that. There are a lot of things in the strategic plan, but the conditions that we are experiencing did not happen overnight. And when I look at the heat imprint of those census tracts where we looked in this, the census data, so much of it was redlined. It's the same areas that redlining has impacted. So we really need to think about how do we undo the historic damage that was done to those communities. These are also the communities with the least growth. And so we're continuing the pattern instead of trying to say, let's stop it and do something intentional. So I would hope that before we adopt a plan, that we really think about intentional actions that will produce change. Actions like shoring up those communities that have housing. They're low-income owners, and we really need to rehab them and help the owners rehab them. It's very important to do that. It's important to invest in pre-K, but what happens after the kids have gone through pre-K and they get in a school system that devalues them? So we're going to have to look the whole length and breadth of where we see the challenges. And I just want to hopefully ask us to be more intentional. Mr. Scott, I will send you my notes on the strategic plan for each of the tiers to make sure that we've covered them from my viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Scipio. And this is an information item for update of the draft of the plan. I just want all you to know, because I got 4 more items I got to get to. This is information. I don't mind the comments. I'm trying to work it, but I got 4 more items to get to, and remember, next month is going to be different for this committee. We'll have a whole lot of stuff. Yep. Councilmember Larson.
I'm just going to pull myself out. Scott, could you elaborate a little bit on the page that says community engagement stakeholder meetings? You have a category that says current needs, and then you have a category that says city support. And I'm trying to understand the differentiation between those 2 categories of listing. One seems to be very directed toward exactly what Councilmember Scipio was talking about: economic disparity, marginal communities, new workforce, affordable housing, digital access, transportation, community policing, and community engagement. Those all seem to be very socially activated. The second category, the first category, however, seems to have some items such as arts and entertainment, infrastructure, communication within the city. And I'm trying to understand, are we suggesting that under the city support, the priority is being given to those categories and not to arts and entertainment and infrastructure maintenance, things like that? How are those 2 categories? Is the one city support simply indicating support for the current needs categories? Is that how that breaks out? I don't quite understand that page.
No, sir. I would say these are the 2 ways that questions were asked in the facilitated meetings for strategic planning. So they set aside part of the meeting and said, what are the current needs of the city? And then they broke out into groups and they came back and they said, okay, well, tell us what the city can support in the future. I would say that this is intended to be looking at both of those, and the things that you mentioned, like supporting arts and entertainment, are obviously woven into the strategic plan, into the draft action items, and a specific priority. So they're not intended that the city support is supposed to be more important than current needs. It was just asking questions in 2 different ways, and so you got different types of feedback, some of them being very interrelated. But I would say definitely the strategic plan is built to support both what we heard as current community needs and things that residents and stakeholders thought were in need of city support in the future as well.
All right. So last observation, is this in paper copy available to residents? Or does it have to go online?
Right now, they would have to go online. If we could make copies of this available in a draft format, it's just a presentation at this point, and we are building the actual publication document. It will absolutely be available once it's fully adopted by council in a draft format. We could find some way to make it available in paper as well. Generally,
we're asking for public comment, though, right, on this?
So there was a significant amount of public comment and feedback at the beginning of the process. There are mechanisms through the city's website to provide that. And we can specifically look at ways here over the course of the next 6 weeks to stand up another forum if we needed to, and other ways to get engagement. We are not planning additional feedback meetings, either virtually or in person, at this stage of the process.
Right. It's going to come down to budget management eventually.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Thank you again, Mr. Tesh, and thank all of your staff in the department. More to come on how we mesh all of the money that's supposed to come against what the Christmas wish list is, okay? City Clerk, would you please call the next item?
Item G4, information on ordinances amending Chapter 2 entitled Administration to create Section 2 through 9, sale or lease of city-owned property or affordable housing purposes, and B, 2 through 10, City of Winston-Salem Housing Justice Act.
Ms. Newman and City Attorney Carmen.
Good afternoon again, Mayor Pro Tem Adams. I'll be happy to start this item off. If I could get Madam Clerk to display the chart, and I will try to be brief. What I decided to do, since we've looked at this item a couple of times, was to have 3 categories. 1, the existing language, 2, the prior draft ordinance, and then the current proposed draft ordinance. As it relates to the sale or lease of city-owned property for affordable housing purposes, which is the first ordinance that we're going to talk about, there really is not an existing ordinance that's focused on having a program regarding the sale or lease of city-owned property for affordable housing purposes. Over the years, there have been various individual resolutions adopted for the sale of city-owned property to various entities to create or provide affordable housing. Now, in terms of the prior draft language, which was reviewed by this committee about this time last year, the objective of the program is to create a program that is intentional about the sale or lease of city-owned properties for the creation of affordable housing. Based upon the current proposed draft, that objective has not changed. It still remains the same. Next slide, please. In terms of the ordinance that you looked at last year, the properties to be included in the affordable housing program included all city-owned residential properties. There's an opportunity for a waiver or an exemption to be granted by the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee, in which the committee would allow for certain properties upon the request of a council member or staff to be removed from the program. The proposed draft ordinance is still focused on residential properties, but it also allows the opportunity for commercial properties to be included in the program, provided, of course, they are rezoned and can be used for residential purposes. The prior draft ordinance, in terms of affordability, it made reference to the Community Development Department's guidelines and HUD's guidelines regarding affordability. The draft ordinance that you have before you actually has several new definitions. The first of which is affordable housing, which is housing that is designed, developed, and constructed or renovated to serve eligible households with an income that is no more than 80% of the area median income. There's also a definition for market rate housing, which is housing that is designed, developed, or constructed or renovated to serve eligible households with an income that is 120% or more of the area median income. Then there's mixed income housing, and that is housing that is designed, developed, constructed, or renovated to provide housing to households with an income that meets each of the following categories. Affordable housing, at least 65% of the units must serve households that fall into this category. Workforce housing and market rate housing. Next page, please. And I'll explain the significance of each of these shortly. And then there's a definition for workforce housing, which is housing that is designed, developed, and constructed or renovated to serve eligible households with an income that is between 81% and 120% of the area median income. And these definitions are important because now the proposed ordinance is more targeted in terms of income. So for example, for multifamily housing, the purchaser or lessee of city-owned property for the provision of multifamily housing will be required to set aside 65% of the total units developed or renovated. And of that 65%, the categories are as follows. 20% of the units shall be set aside for eligible households with an income of 30% and below of the area median income. 30% of the total units shall be set aside for eligible households with incomes at 31 to 50% of the area median income. And then 50% of the total units shall be set aside for eligible households with incomes, apologize for the typo, at 51 to 80% of the area median income. And basically what we're trying to do is within the concept of affordable housing, be a little bit more intentional and targeted in terms of making sure all incomes are addressed in affordable housing. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to serve those at the lower end of that category. And so the desire is to be more intentional so we have housing basically for everyone. And of the remaining 35%, it can be for either workforce housing, market rate housing, or a combination thereof. Next page, please. Okay. For single family housing, again, we didn't have the categories in the prior draft that we now have. Again, for single family housing, the purchaser of city-owned property for the provision of single family housing, rental or home ownership for affordable housing purposes will be required to set aside 65% of the single family homes built for eligible households within the income requirements of affordable and workforce housing. Of that 65%, 55% will go to affordable housing, and the remaining 10% will go to workforce housing, which leaves basically 35%, which can be used for a combination of workforce housing, market rate housing. An individual who purchases a single lot for home ownership must also meet the income guidelines for affordable and workforce housing. And again, this ordinance, just like the Housing Justice Act, contains a provision that allows City Council in its sole and absolute discretion to relax the requirements if the purchaser proposed financing will not support the income guidelines. But again, the whole purpose of the change is to be a little bit more intentional about creating affordable housing and also addressing specifically workforce housing, mixed income housing, so that housing is provided at those multiple levels. Next page, please. Okay. The affordability period and deed restrictions. Basically, the prior ordinance, and it has not changed in the new draft, required if property sold to an individual for home ownership, the affordability period and the deed restriction period was basically 30 years. If property is to be sold to develop or construct rental housing, then the restriction was 50 years. Next page, please. For properties leased, it was basically 99 years. Both the prior ordinance and the new one that you have before you requires both annual inspections and an affordability review. I also note, and I have incorporated into the new draft ordinance, Session Law 2021-44, which is the legislation that the city sought to be able to sell city-owned property with or without compensation. Basically, you can donate it as long as that property is being used for affordable housing. So I set forth in the new draft that legislation with the requirements of a deed restriction, and also if the buyer fails to comply with the requirements, then the property will revert to the city. Next page, please. And so that's an overview of the changes to the ordinance as it relates to the sale or lease of city-owned property. I'll be happy to take questions on that before I go to the Housing Justice Act, or I can wait, whichever Madam Chair prefers.
Are there any questions from the committee or council or comments? I'd rather have questions.
Questions.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Yes. First of all, just a quick comment. I really applaud getting some definition around our terms. And it's very hard to sort of proceed into this unless you know kind of what you're shooting at. I do have a question about whether or not we have gone to anybody in the market to test the percentage numbers to see whether those actually will prohibit deals from happening that we want to have happen. Are they realistic in terms of what people are willing to do on the private sector?
We have not yet done that, but that's certainly part of the plan. Just wanted to see if what we were thinking and trying to be more intentional about kind of was acceptable, at least preliminarily, to the committee before we took that next step.
Great. I think this is very good. I'm very, very happy with this.
Councilmember Scipio. You're on mute. You're still on mute now.
Gotcha. My desktop is a little hard to deal with. I think this is a wonderful ordinance that will help clarify a lot of discussions that people have, particularly with developers. My question was, there's a section called financial assistance from the city, page 5 of the ordinance. And so I'm assuming that that assistance is targeted to help developers and not necessarily individuals who want to build a house outside of a developer, individuals.
I think it's primarily developers, but I will defer to Community Development Director, Ms. Marla Newman, if she is on the call.
I am. Good afternoon, Chair Adams, members of the committee, members of the council. Yes, the idea here is looking more towards the development community, as they will be the ones primarily trying to help bring us the volume of units that we're needing to fill the gap in affordable housing that we currently experience. So this is targeted more towards developers as opposed to individuals.
However, because I know some individuals who want to build homes on city-owned property in one of our qualified census tracts. Are we saying with this ordinance that this is the city's policy for developers only, and that we would not be selling to individuals?
I'll be happy to answer that question if I may, Madam Chair. It does not preclude the sale of individuals. In fact, it's mentioned in a couple of sections. I believe the pot of monies that are mentioned are probably more than likely targeted to developers, and there may be other pots that are not listed, and we can certainly look at that. So it does not preclude that. No, it does not.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions before the attorney goes on to the next piece of this? Attorney Carmen. Or Ms. Newman.
Okay, if I can get the clerk's office to put the chart back up, that would be great. If we could go to the heading Housing Justice Act. Okay. And for the most part, the Housing Justice Act, as I mentioned earlier, have 3 categories: existing language, prior draft, and the current proposed draft. In terms of existing language, there does not appear to be an ordinance or resolution establishing a Housing Justice Act. In terms of the prior draft, the objective of the Housing Justice Act is an anti-poverty initiative that is designed to reduce homelessness and eliminate barriers to housing, such as criminal convictions, sources of income, and lack of affordability. And that remains the same in the current draft that you have before you. Next page, please. In terms of application of the ordinance, I just want it to be clear that this ordinance only applies to properties that receive city funding, general fund dollars, bond funds, federal and state funds, basically city funds. It does not apply to the private sector where there are no city funds involved. In terms of application, the current draft remains the same as it was before. Definitions, just as we did with the ordinance that pertains to the lease or sale of city-owned property, we added those same definitions to the Housing Justice Act. Criminal records. So the Housing Justice Act prohibits using a criminal record as a sole basis for denying housing unless the conviction was for assault, communicating threats, or illegal use of weapons. And the restriction applies for 10 years. That has not changed in the current draft. It remains the same. The ordinance before and now prohibits housing discrimination based upon sources of income. Sources of income shall include, but are not limited to, financial assistance from any rental assistance program. Next slide, please. supplemental security income, Social Security, pension, and other retirement benefits, alimony, child support, federal housing choice vouchers, other housing subsidy program, whether paid directly to the program participant, landlord, or other representative. So the Housing Justice Act, in terms of affordability requirement, the city does have an existing resolution from 2015 that provides, if you receive city funds, it provides a 10% set aside in the following manner. At least 5% of the total units must be leased to households whose incomes are 50 to 80% of the area median income. And then at least 5% of the total units must be leased to households whose incomes are 80 to 120% of the area median income. And that is a 15-year requirement. So that is currently in existence. The affordability requirement that was in the prior draft basically had a 20% set aside. At least 5% of the total units must be leased to households whose incomes are 50 to 80% of the area median income, and at least 15% of the total units must be leased to households whose incomes are 80 to 120% of the area median income. It too had a 15-year requirement. The ordinance that you have before you now is different in that it is more intentional in terms of, again, trying to address the different households and make sure that we are targeting those various households and incomes. The revised draft provides for a 33% set aside in the following manner. 10% of the total units must be made available for eligible households with incomes of no more than 30% of the area median income. 20% of the total units must be made available for eligible households with incomes between 31 and 50% of the area median income. And then 70% of the total units must be made available for eligible households with incomes between 51 and 80% of the area median income. And that is the breakdown of that 33% set aside. The remaining 67% may be workforce housing, market rate housing, or a combination thereof. Instead of it being a 15-year requirement, it is a 30-year requirement. Next page, please. And just as with the ordinance that relates to the sale or lease of city-owned property, this ordinance contains an exception, or at least allows city council in its sole and absolute discretion to relax the requirements if necessary. And so that's, in a nutshell, the Housing Justice Act, the changes from the last time to now. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Councilmember McIntosh, Chair of Public Works, has allowed us privilege of 10 more minutes of his meetings. Will start 10 minutes after General Government. Councilmember Clark, okay.
Yeah, I would pass all this by. The Housing Authority would be the main one. I'm just trying to think. And there's some other folks, but folks that do build on either with city money or whatever. I want to be sure we don't price ourselves out of the market. The other one I had, just as an aside on the criminal issue, we just scolded Rolling Hills for not kicking out criminals. Does that mean they kick somebody out for selling drugs that the next apartment down's got to give them an apartment? I mean, we've just been through this with Rolling Hills trying to get them to clean up, and now it looked like to me we're telling them just the opposite. But my main point is to be sure we check with the folks that actually do this to be sure we're not creating something that will result in nothing getting built.
Yeah. If I may, Madam Chair.
Yes, Attorney Carmen.
And I'll be brief, but I think the difference here is that it prohibits that as being the sole basis for denying housing. I mean, there may be other factors in which, would prohibit a person from being eligible, but to use that as the sole basis where city funds are involved is what I think the concern is. Councilmember Taylor may be able to shed some more light on the concern as well, since this was an initiative that he brought to my attention.
Okay.
Councilmember Scipio.
Thank you, Ms. Carmen. Your summaries make this fairly almost clearer than mud. Will we be able to get your two summaries that you just presented?
I'll be happy to send them to you, sure.
That'll help a lot. And my other thing happened to do with the criminal record also. It's explain how the restriction is handled. Is it that person is restricted for a period of 10 years from going into housing that we help subsidize? And if somebody's had an offense and it was 30 years ago, does that come up at the time they want housing and they're restricted for 10 years, or is it the violation was 10 years old? I'm not real sure on that restriction.
I'll be happy to respond. The ordinance provides that a person who receives city funds for the construction, development, rehab, or renovation of residential or housing property basically cannot, in its sale or rental of property, use that person's criminal record as the sole basis for denying that person housing. And the restriction, that prohibition would stay in place basically 10 years from the receipt of city funds. So that developer, whomever it is that gets the city funds, would be required to refrain from using that criminal record, with some exceptions, as the sole basis for denying a tenant occupancy for 10 years. So if they now have a rental property that they've used city funds for, and they get an applicant who has that history there, then they can't deny that person an opportunity to rent that apartment complex or whatever the unit happens to be, is how that works. And again, it's 10 years from the point that they receive city funds.
Correct.
And certainly if council wants to, or the committee has a desire to change it to a shorter term period, or change the categories that shall not be used to deny housing, that's certainly up to the committee.
Thank you, Attorney Carmen, for information, everyone. You know we have an NDO we just passed, a non-discrimination ordinance. We got a human relations department. We got other ordinances against discrimination for reentry and those people that, yes, they might have made some mistakes, but our job is to try to acclimate them back into society. If they have checked all the boxes that they need to check, there needs to be a pathway for everybody to be able to get housing. Councilmember Larson.
I think one of the questions is.
And looks like, City Manager, we're not gonna get to these other 3 items. And I know, we're gonna have to move them to the top of the list for next month. Top of the list, not middle, not bottom, top of the list. Councilmember Larson.
To address one of the concerns of Councilmember Clark, as I would understand it, the discrimination against bringing in somebody into an apartment complex based on his previous criminal record could not be considered as one of the protected categories that we've talked about. Once they're in the apartments, however, if we, like Rolling Hills, if we see criminal activities, then that would be a reason to extract them, would it not?
That is correct. And I was getting ready to make that very point. This just prohibits the developer, landlord from who receives city funds from denying them housing, using that as the sole basis to deny housing to that individual. Now, once they're there, if they engage in activity that under their house rules and so forth, which we talked about with Rolling Hills, that prohibits them from being eligible to remain there, then it's certainly well within that developer owner's authority to do what's necessary to evict that tenant.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember, did I hear from everybody yet? Councilmember Monday, did you have your hand up? Okay. Any other questions or comments? I think we're on the right path, City Attorney and Ms. Newman and Mr. Garrity and all others involved and the council. Again, we heard you that I know a lot of you haven't been doing this as long as some of the rest of us. So first of all, it's about making sure you understand the lingo, the definitions that are vital to being successful at trying to do what we're doing, and that's hopefully to build some houses. People hear certain words in building houses and the NIMBY pops up, the NIMBY genie pops up. And we just want to make sure going forward that not just you, but the community knows that we will be doing everything to get this done. So are there any other comments or questions from this committee? If not, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.